Shmai Wales, Croeso, and welcome to the impactful and powerful day, the United Nations Day for the Elimination of Race Discrimination. Wales is coming together with a collective of a number of organizations, university establishments, institutions, businesses, to declare that today will not pass in Wales until we talk about anti-racism. Croeso Ibal, my colleague and friend, Natalie Jones, who's part of our team here at Race Council Cymru, will be speaking to you in Welsh. And all through the day, you'll have Welsh translations coming up in captions running through the program. My name is Uzo Iwobi, and I'm the Chief Executive of Race Council Cymru. I'll be hosting the day today and introducing our wonderful and powerful speakers. Over to you, Natalie, just to bring your greeting.
Croeso I chi gyd a diolch am ymuno gyda ni heddiw. Mae gennym ni llwyth o siaradwyr wych sydd yn mynd i egluro pam a sut gallan ni gyd bod yn gwrthwiliol. Felly diolch a mwynhewch.
Diolch, enjoy, mwynhewch. Okay, so first and foremost, we're going to warmly go straight to our chair, and many of you know our chair, the first Asian judge to be appointed, the first and only, I would say, Asian judge to be appointed here in Wales. And he brought the Commission for Racial Equality here. He became the first Welsh commissioner to serve here and in the UK, and really led the investigation of the Commission for Racial Equality into prisons in the United Kingdom earlier than the David Lammy report did. So warm welcome to our chair, the formidable judge himself, Judge Ray Singh, CBE. Over to you, Chair.
Diolch yn fawr, Uzo, thank you. Croeso, bore da, bula, salam, walaikum, namaste, sasrikal, salamat, salom, kupa kewa, patikana. Welcome all to this memorable day here today. Changing on future Welsh history, embedding anti-racism in education, business in Wales, and beyond Wales, no doubt, as us be the leaders in this field. 5 decades ago, at the end of a very busy day in court, I dropped my solicitor at his home. He said, come in for a cup of tea. I went in for a cup of tea. His mother had prepared tea in a bigger form for him. And she said, share it. And I had some food there. And they said, you must meet my nephew, who's come from near Reading. It was 5-year-old Simon. He came down in his white gown, dressing gown, shook hands with me, and then he turned his hand around to see if there was any mark left, color left on his hand. And that is how young children understood when the meeting with black, brown people. Few decades ahead, jumping ahead, I think probably Professor, one of the professors who was sharing the round table here today, who's all the way in Australia. I think she may well have done one of the researches in schools where children were saying we're not allowed to sit next to brown and black children to have lunch. Where did that racism come from? From school? No. Decades later, the same was happening in all fields. In my view, racism has gone on either overtly or covertly throughout for a long time. The police don't understand that. The lawyers don't understand that. The Crown Prosecution Service don't understand. The judiciary doesn't understand. prison services don't understand, probation service don't understand. It is quite clear that racism, it starts at home. And this is where I have maintained for many, many decades, preaching in the wilderness and joined by Uzo recently to continue the argument that education is a panacea to find a way forward. Racism starts at home. Children need to be rescued from such an evil teaching. This is where education comes to play such an important role. The history, Black history, Asian history needs to be taught. Children need to understand that Black Asians don't come here to take their jobs. That I urge you all who are gathered here today from all different walks of life, but educationists in particular, to maintain your commitment, not just for today, but going forward, to ensure that that future anti-racism is embedded in education business so that it can live together without being suffering the trauma of Zahid Mubarak and many others who have gone through here in Wales of losing their loved ones, youngsters, their lives taken away prematurely because of their color. So colleagues, friends, let's join together and make it a reality here in Wales. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Absolutely well said, Chair. A phenomenal start, a speech to energize us and place us firmly on our path today. We are here to say no tolerance, zero tolerance policy to racism in education and business. Black lives, Asian lives, ethnic minority lives, gypsy travelers, Roma people, we deserve a place, same as other counterparts, and none other to bring this truth forward for us today than our absolutely powerful Professor Charlotte Williams, OBE, from Bangor University, who, as we know, Welsh government commissioned to lead the work on producing the report that has transformed the history of Welsh curriculum. And due to her work and the work of so many other campaigners here in Wales, Black history will be taught in all schools across Wales as mandatory. The contributions of people of Black descent will never be forgotten. Please warmly welcome Professor Charlotte Williams, OBE.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, Uzo, and thanks to all for having me speak today. It's absolutely wonderful to speak to such a committed audience, an audience that's here committed to the elimination of racism. And people often ask, and they often ask me, what can change racist attitudes and behaviours? And education, as you've heard our chair say, is absolutely key to this. And what a great place to start in this conference when thinking about the elimination of racism is the children of the nation. They represent the opportunity for change into the future. And of course, I'm going to say it again and boast it as many times as I can. In November of 2021, Wales became the first nation in the UK to make mandatory Black, Asian and minority ethnic education within the new curriculum. And this represents a historic step in education policy and practice in Wales. In the education section of the newly entitled Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, the government has signalled the new curriculum for Wales as the centrepiece of the national mission. And we know that the new curriculum states as one of its four purposes the ambition to enable all learners to become ethical, and informed citizens of Wales and the world. And I want to talk a little bit about the significance of the report that was produced, this groundbreaking step in educational policy in Wales, and encourage you to read the report and its 51 recommendations, and it's entitled Communities' Contributions, Cynefin, Black, Asian and Minority Ethnicities in the New Curriculum. Sadly, there's a lot of misunderstanding about racism. Too often, it's reduced to an individual level, looking at the behaviours or actions of particular individuals. And we know that that allows us to dodge systems and processes that perpetuate racism. What the Macpherson report years ago called a few bad apples, without looking at the institutions and the systems that through neglect, denial, promote exclusionary and racist assumptions and processes. The Black Lives Matter campaign showed us this, and what we've seen in Wales subsequently is a momentous cranking up of attention to racial inequalities, to addressing racial inequalities. But we have a bigger framework even than the national framework. If we look at the UN Declaration of Rights of the Child, which provides a plethora of protective rights, including the right to equal and fair treatment, but also the right to belong to a country. The Children's Commissioner in Wales has provided us with a rights-based framework for schools, an education-specific framework that speaks to this inclusive curriculum. Now, we know that there's considerable evidence of inequalities in our education system, and you'll hear something more of that as we go through this morning. A strong body of evidence, both quantitative and qualitative, speaks to disparities in attainment, to disparities in school experiences, to disparities in representation in the workforce, and often to the negative experiences of Black educators themselves in terms of pay and progression. But there's also, very sadly, evidence of neglect in the broader constituency of our schools, in school cultures that appear benign, but through sins of omission do damage. We all know what the absence of a representative curriculum means for Black pupils. Extensive research tells us about the impacts on our young children and young people, on our children and young people in terms of their literacy, their development, their self-esteem, and their aspirations. Identifying with characters in textbooks can give significant value to their experience. And this is very important, not only for Black children and minority ethnic children, but for all children. An equal amount of research tells us that children generally learn their attitudes and values from books and transfer what they experience in literature into the real world. So giving books that are more broadly represented, books and resources that are more broadly representative and reflect deep and sound cultural values, teach children how to behave in broader society. And we know, therefore, that for all children, the cultivation of positive values, not racial biases and stereotypes, but positive values can come from having a broader, deeper, more representative education. Our school resources are woefully deficient in this respect as we stand, and that's why this step is so important. Not just in terms of the content of learning, but the ways, thinking about the ways in which children learn. Their personal inquiry needs to be promoted and valued. How are they able to see role models in school, the shape of their future selves, and how they experience that sense of belonging and identity formation in schools? The lobby, as Professor Uzo pointed out, has been going on for years. the Black History debate, as we've called it, asking the provocative question, why not more Black history in our school curriculum? And we know that a whole kind of confluence of events comes together, including acknowledge the commitment of the Minister for Social Justice, Jane Hutt, who you'll hear from later, the commitment of her then Special Advisor, Professor Uzo Iwobi, the commitment of grassroots groups to progress this lobby and push it forward. We also know that following a pandemic, during a pandemic, health disparities for Black, Asian and non-ethnic peoples became evident, and Professor Ogbonna will speak to a social economic report that again pointed to the importance of the curriculum. I think it's important to mention that the broader government approach gives momentum and sustainability to this development in Wales. The value-based orientation of Welsh social policy making, namely progressive universalism, the idea that we should have high participation, high collaboration, high trust and equality of outcome. This will make this report travel. And let's also note the young people who demanded change and were demanding the government take forward this agenda. We all saw the wonderful Angel Adam speaking in the UK Youth Parliament. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly there, Angel, but it was wonderful to see you. And we know about the peer reviewers in research undertaken by Race Alliance Wales and by Show Racism, the Red Card. Again, we'll hear about their work in terms of advocating for zero racism in schools. So much good work on the ground has been done and has produced a groundswell of change. The report itself is just the instrument to push forward this activity. But we all know it's in the hands of those on the ground, the teachers, the pupils, the parents, the Black and minority organisation, to translate into actions to embed and sustain what we have recommended. The portrait of what we found was this: no particular systematic approach in terms of strategy or resource development. And therefore the picture across Wales is ad hoc. Some schools doing marvellous work and others just beginning on this journey. We found teachers struggling with their confidence, fearful of taking forward discussions about racism, fearful of taking forward changes that this agenda requires, and perhaps not having the competence to do so. Where there was work going on, we found that the bias in the selection of materials did not reflect particularly a multicultural house. We may well have seen schools taking very seriously the civil rights movement, taking very seriously input on slavery and those types of histories, but not necessarily able to connect it to Story Cymru. And we found a woefully white workforce. It's a truism in Wales that you are very unlikely, as in my day, from when you enter school at primary level, right through your primary, secondary education, even in your further higher education, it's very unlikely that you will have a Black teacher. And I think that's a really sad fact. A sad fact of the evidence that we saw and something that we are addressing. And we found schools with very static statutory equality plans, not translating those into commitments in terms of learning and teaching. And schools that weren't taking advantage of the plethora of stakeholder engagement that they could within their own local communities, but within the national community, to draw on skills and expertise of people of colour, of people from different minority groups and minority organisations. Add to this evidence of downright racism in schools and the lack of implementation of racial bullying procedures and policies. So that's a very sad picture. But let's be positive. Our vision in this report was that every learner in Wales would have the opportunity to explore the diverse experiences and contributions of Black, Asian and minority ethnic peoples, past and present. And accordingly, that every teacher in Wales, in every area of learning and experience, will be equipped and resourced to meet those expectations. They will understand the manifestations of racism. They will feel enabled and supported to build curricula that reflects attention to these themes, and they will feel supported and enabled to place the contributions of Black, Asian and minority ethnic peoples in the context of the wider history and development of Wales as a multicultural society. And so we made 51 recommendations, and we added to those the 42 from the research undertaken by the education workforce that you'll hear a little bit about later. And these recommendations speak to the development of resources, they speak to the professional learning at all levels of the workforce, from initial teacher education right through the existing workforce to school leadership level and to school governors. They speak to school level actions that will create that ethos of anti-racism within schools, and to Estin's capacity to review this development as we go forward. Qualifications Wales are also working hard to adapt the assessment systems that we have to reflect diversity across all the subject areas. And so what we're looking for in producing sustainability for this effort is an enabling culture within schools. And I've spoken very often about these 3 L's, that we need leaders who are going to demonstrate how this agenda is to be taken forward. And I don't just mean the leadership team, I mean people who are prepared to be catalyzers and leaders in their fields and leaders in their disciplines, carrying us forward. I think we need levers, that is financial levers, bursaries, financial incentives, Estin inspectorates, peer review, etc. Those kinds of levers that make this work sustainable. But very importantly, we need learners, people who are prepared to give it a go, to really engage with these themes and take forward this mission in a deep and honest way. What we don't want is the ad hocery that we found. What we don't want is this kind of add-on multiculturalism. Oh, it's Black History Month, let's do some activities around Black history. What we really want to see is a truly transformative and critical pedagogy. That means how children learn, how we teach them, how they feel in the classroom, how that ethos at the school promotes inclusivity and valorizes the contribution of Black and minority ethnic people. A lot of work's underway, and there's some wonderful examples that I can share with you. I've been working continuously with the Welsh Government on the interpretation and implementation of the 51 recommendations that we made. There's a tender out as we speak that's being reviewed for resource development to ensure supporting materials for teachers and practitioners. We've had the wonderful new teaching award, the Betty Campbell MBE Award, which is a teaching award for professional excellence. And that is so wonderful to have Betty's name attached to the award. We've had the outcome of an Estin review of Welsh history that includes Black history, and they have confirmed our findings of a deficit in terms of Black history, and there are actions afoot to address this. The Educational Workforce Council, and I don't want to preempt what Ben's going to tell you, have developed a strategy on IT, initial teacher education recruitment, which includes for the first time financial incentives to attract more people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. I'm very, very proudly, and you will hear about the developments in terms of professional learning, the DARPL project, or the DARPL virtual campus, as we call it, and you will hear a bit more about that today as well. School governors are being equipped, guidance has been shared with them on developing diversity champions amongst their number. There have been so many events, podcasts, presentations and workshops for people to draw on who are interested to develop their practice. And as I mentioned, Qualifications Wales are developing a new approach to qualifications at GCSE level. The Welsh Government's about to publish our annual progress report on this theme. So look out for that as well. Oh, and there are schools, of course, signing up to the Zero Racism agenda. I'll conclude now by saying we know racism is pernicious, manifold and sustained. It's bad for our children, all our children. It's an abuse of human rights. No child should have to go to school and find themselves abused because of their background or their belief. The statutory, ethical, demographic and disciplinary mandate are clear. Good quality educational provision will include attention to these perspectives, experiences and contributions. Teaching practitioners were going to be upskilled to deliver on this commitment, and they will be provided with the support and guidance to do so. All of these considerations are spoken about prompt attention to rethinking and reimagining our curriculum in concert with a range of stakeholders. Nobody can do this work by themselves. It is hard work. And rather than a reiteration exists, the evidence base tells us it's time for innovation and time for change to establish a curriculum that more accurately reflects the changing world in which we live. This refreshed is going to be a concerted effort on all our part. It doesn't belong to government. It doesn't belong to that report. Change. The vision is of an anti-racist Wales by 2030, and education has a significant role in creating this more equitable society. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr, Professor Charlotte Williams, as powerful, as impactful, and as effective as usual. I am so in awe of all that you are doing and have achieved for all the people of Wales. All the children of Wales are going to have a much better opportunity to be global citizens because of the work that you have done. Thank you so much for tuning in and speaking at this conference. And now it gives me great pleasure to warmly welcome the Vice Chancellor of all Vice Chancellors, I have to say, a fantastic man who works hard to ensure that inclusion is at the very fabric of his university and has pledged his support for this conference in a very, very practical way. We thank you, Professor Medwin Hughes, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, who also oversees the University of Wales, and he's here in person to bring forward some information about what he is doing, in his university to be inclusive. A warm welcome to you, Professor Medwyn Hughes, everybody. Diolch yn fawr. Croeso.
Bore da I chi, dwi'n falch iawn o gael y cyfle i ymuno gyda chi wrth i chi drafod pwysigrwydd addysg ar gyfer gwrthiliaeth. So great to be with you today as we consider the importance of embedding anti-racism in education and business. I want to reaffirm several of the points that have already been made today and to place it within the context of the university, some of the work of the institution, and also a wider international context. We're all here because we believe in empowerment and also equity. Equity that every voice should be heard in the context of Wales. If we believe, as we all do, in a responsive Wales, a Wales that focuses upon the needs of those that are yet to be born within the Future Generation Act, will secure inclusiveness, resilience, equity, and cohesive communities. That can only happen if we make sure that we have a country that has very clear statement on zero tolerance for racism. The values which we've all seen that the government have accepted within the Equality Action Plan focuses upon openness, transparency, a rights-based approach, and lived experience. We've already heard from the first speaker the importance of that inter-engagement between education and community. And what we really need to do is to reaffirm the collective power of Wales's cultural mosaic. And that can only happen when there is deep, deep respect in the context of all of the cultures that is associated with this country. Every child, every learner has the right to learn in an equitable environment where all cultures, religions, identities, and languages are recognized and valued, and where the educational system itself has regard to respect in all of these areas. Anti-racist education has to be at the heart of systemic change within our educational modelling in Wales. And we know, as we have heard already, that there are so many excellent work being undertaken. We have a real opportunity in Wales as we reimagine the curriculum, as we reevaluate our processes, our strategies for pedagogy, for developing citizenship that shows great respect for all cultures, for all traditional values within our country. We need to make sure that the youngsters of Wales, as they prepare for a new world, has the confidence in who they are, in respecting who they are, and making sure that the community as a whole respect the diverse cultures of this great land. We've heard so much about race equality, and that has to be at the heart of our educational system for Wales. I very much like the research of Rowena Ashad, where she focuses on two key areas of engagement, one on outcome measures and the other on the civic value, the moral capital, which educational systems have to place at the heart of any reconfiguration. Anti-racist education has to be a deep engagement where all partners of education are involved, where we have to support an educational experience where every child, every young person can flourish within an environment that allows them to be who they are and to show a deep, deep respect. An effective anti-racist education strategy will empower learners to develop their own values, beliefs, and cultures, and will see the importance of all traditional cultures in Wales. It will nurture a historical literacy, which helps learners to understand Wales's history, but Wales's history in the context of empire, colonialism, transatlantic slavery, and the diversity of the past of Wales. What we need to do is to make sure that the modelling, the curriculum frameworks are fit for purpose. And as we now work to develop the curriculum, and we'll hear far more about that later in this seminar, this is the opportunity to put those cultural nodes at the heart of the design principles of effective educational reform for our country. Now, how do we build an anti-racist approach for curriculum development? Wales isn't a monocultural structure. And yet, in the past, our educational syllabi, our pedagogy of training teachers has not had a proper regard to focusing upon anti-racist issues. Now is the time to realign that with an open, transparent, right-based approach, where equity is at the heart of our educational modeling. And I think it's so important on the recommendations we've heard so far, that those 50+ recommendations are at the heart of investment. What we do know in remodeling educational systems across the world, significant investment has to be made to train our teachers, to support curriculum, to facilitate change. And I'm very pleased to see the clear commitment that our government is giving in the context of that engagement. It is so important. The curriculum has to focus upon normalizing. The normalizing power of cultures, of identity, of ethnicity is absolutely key to deliver on this particular subject. And that's why I was so pleased to hear the previous speaker talking with passion about the way that we are now working and interacting with our schools, with our families, and making sure that the interrelationship between the home, the school, and society are at the heart of developing a meaningful dialogue and discourse. The contribution of a right-based approach and a right-based education model for all of our schools, colleges, and universities is absolutely imperative. We are, as we speak, in the process where our Parliament, our Senate, is considering the tertiary bill. And that tertiary bill has to have regard, as it will, to the rights, to the cultures of all of our citizens in Wales. I'm very much aware of some of the key findings and key statements of the Maastricht Global Education Declaration that focused as far as back 2002, that the equity of justice, of human rights, and the equity of voice is at the heart of a meaningful educational system. For so many years, my university has been focusing upon the importance of intercultural competencies, be that within the school context or within a research domain. But I want to focus for a moment on the importance of intercultural values as we define teacher training strategies, as we develop a pedagogy for our future teachers. This will only work if we have invested significantly in an open, transparent structure that lived experiences of the citizens of Wales have been articulated and have been shared in a proper way, through showing the importance of intercultural dialogue here in Wales to allow them to be global education ambassadors further afield. A country that is committed to supporting sustainable development goals, the aspirations for those that are yet to be born, surely also focuses upon cultural diversity and respecting intercultural dialogue. What Wales is doing is leading the way in showing that respect, in focusing upon the importance of equity and parity of culture, of language. And we stand together to say no against racism. And we invest together in developing a shared understanding, a common narrative that talks about respect, empathy, self-awareness, confidence to be who we are and to be proud of who we are, so that our voices together stand as one. I'm so pleased to be able to join you today. What we are doing in Wales is being affirmative to the values of equity. And if we really believe in inclusion, in making an equal Wales, we work together to secure that our educational system will be transparent, will focus upon lived experiences, and the children of today, and certainly the children of tomorrow, will know that this is a country that respects everybody. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Vice Chancellor, for that invigorating speech, and we hope very much that people will take this to heart and build that zero tolerance policy on against racism. So if you're watching today, go online to www.zeroracismwales and sign the pledge. Pledge as an individual or as your leader of your own organization. Sign. It is important that we work together to eradicate racism in education and business. And now we have a fantastic speaker from the Education Workforce Council. We're going to warmly welcome Ben Lester, who's one of the senior managers in the EWC, to brief us on the critical work that they're doing in this area. Warm welcome, Ben.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Uzo, for that welcome and for the invitation to attend this really important event today. I'm going to talk this morning about the EWC's work on the diversity of the school workforce and also on our recently published Good Practice Guide on Tackling Racism. Before I discuss those subjects, though, I thought it would be useful to just give you a quick overview of who we are and what we do as an organisation. So our aims are set out in the Education Act 2014, under which we were established, and these are around maintaining and improving standards of professional conduct amongst teachers and others who support teaching and learning in Wales, and I'll come to the others in a moment. Contributing to improving standards of teaching and the quality of learning in Wales, and maintaining public trust and confidence and safeguarding the interests of learners, parents and the general public. So the range of our work encompasses regulation of the education workforce, which is our core work, providing advice to Welsh Government, promoting careers in the education workforce, leading initiatives and work, and finally, as an independent body, we're also able to bid for commercial contracts relevant to our remit for the benefit of our registrants. So the role we play in relation to the education workforce in Wales is analogous to that of other organisations such as these, the GMC, Social Care Wales and so on, the role that they play for their professions. Just to give you an idea of who we register and in what numbers, groups registered with us are youth workers, youth support workers, work-based learning practitioners, FE learning support workers, FE teachers, school teachers, and school learning support workers, who are our largest registrant group. So in early 2020, the Education Workforce Council was asked by Welsh Government to undertake a piece of research relating to the ethnic diversity of the school workforce in Wales. This followed a rapid review of evidence that was undertaken by Professor David Egan. And his work, which is known as Phase 1, looked into the recruitment of Black, Asian and minority ethnic entrants into initial teacher education, the retention and career progression of Black, Asian and minority ethnic teachers, and the possible impact of having a more diverse workforce on the attainment of Black, Asian and minority ethnic pupils. So the Welsh Government then approached us to build on this and compile some more detailed evidence relating to the ethnic profile of the school workforce in Wales, looking across learning support workers, teachers, senior leaders and heads. The Phase 2 research undertaken in 2020 provided detailed evidence from the EWC's register of practitioners relating to the ethnic profile of the school workforce in Wales, learning support workers and so on. It also considered how the ethnic profile of the school workforce compared to that of the school population, the school pupil population, using PLASC data, and the wider population of Wales based on ONS data. We also looked at recruitment into initial teacher education, whether there might be a more diverse pipeline of new entrants emerging into the profession. And then in addition to the data analysis, we also considered what could be done to increase diversity. So we looked at whether there are lessons from elsewhere in the UK and overseas. And we also looked at other professions that have successfully begun to increase their diversity. The report sets out a lot of data, and I'll post the link to it in the chat in a moment, so you can all have a look at it in your own time. There's not going to be time to go into the detail the data in detail this morning, unfortunately, but I just want to highlight a couple of graphs that I think are particularly important. So first of all, this one looks at the ethnicity of school teachers in Wales, and you'll see that in 2019, just 3% of teachers in Wales were from ethnic groups other than white. And now, if you look at the next slide, you can see that 11% of pupils in Wales in 2019 were from non-white backgrounds. So clearly the teaching workforce isn't representative of the wider population. And this is the case also amongst school learning support workers, senior managers, and to an even greater extent amongst heads. As of March 2019, there were just 7 serving head teachers or executive heads who were known to be from non-white ethnic backgrounds, and none of those were Black or Black British. So the next question is what can be done to improve the diversity of such an unrepresentative workforce? We looked for inspiration in the Phase 2 project at other countries and professions, and these included Scotland, which launched a strategy in 2018 to increase the number of Black and minority ethnic teachers in Scottish schools, with an aim of being at least on a par with the country's BAME population by 2030. We also looked at other professions and various other initiatives, and on the basis of this, we came up with 43 policy ideas that we thought the Welsh Government should consider. They then asked us to undertake Phase 3, which focused on talking to key stakeholders, listening to the voices of ethnic minority communities, but also those of other key stakeholders, including schools, universities, unions, and local authorities. And the conversations that we had with stakeholders provided really useful feedback on the policy ideas that we'd suggested in Phase 2, and also allowed us to understand different people's lived experiences of the school workforce, of the school system in Wales. And we worked with the stakeholders to co-construct a final list of recommendations for the Welsh Government to consider. The recommendations were presented to Welsh Government last year and are set out under 11 themes, which you can see here. We don't have time to run through all of those in detail today, so again, I'll post the document in the chat, but particularly want to highlight one thing about these recommendations, which is that they respond to key messages that we heard when we talked to stakeholders. We heard really clearly and often quite movingly actually about people's lived experiences of the system and of racism and discrimination in schools in Wales. And we wanted to make sure that the recommendations didn't just look at things like running effective recruitment campaigns, which are obviously important, but tackled fundamental issues around racism, discrimination, and the culture that exists within our schools, which is absolutely key to persuading more young people from diverse backgrounds to pursue careers within the education workforce. Before I finish, I just want to talk to you very briefly as well about another piece of work that the EWC recently undertook, which is around producing a new good practice guide on tackling racism. We've got a series of good practice guides designed to help registrants to comply with our code of professional conduct. And as you can see here, they cover a wide range of topics, but we felt it was particularly important to do something in this area to help ensure learners feel confident that they'll be safe, supported and treated with fairness and respect when they attend their places of learning. The Good Practice Guide was put together in partnership with the BAME Network and Show Racism Red Card, who've both endorsed it. And it covers, it addresses issues of racism and promoting inclusion, equality and diversity, and provides guidance on compliance with the Code of Professional Conduct and Practice, and steps that people can take to address racism and promote equality including creating an inclusive environment, being informed, guarding against bias, identifying racist behaviour, acting against discrimination, harassment and victimisation, and ensuring that racist incidents are reported and recorded. The guidance also helps practitioners to comply with the requirements of the Equality Act and the Public Sector Equality Duty. And ultimately, the aim is just to help create environments for learners and young people that are, in schools, colleges and other settings that are inclusive and robustly anti-racist. It was launched last November, and we've already had a really positive response from registrants. And we've also recently been contacted by the National Day Nurseries Association, who've asked if they can use the resources to support staff as well. So I'm afraid time's run out now, but as promised, I'll post the links to the documents that I've discussed in the chat. But thanks all for your time and for listening, and look forward to joining the panel later on this morning.
Thank you so much, Ben. Absolutely fantastic information, lots to hear, lots to research, and hopefully you will see the link in the chat to review in your own time, but also an opportunity to pose questions to Ben later on as part of the panel question and answer session later this morning. And now we're going to warmly welcome two professors from Cardiff University who work with us and work in partnership with Spark, the research initiative at the university. And they have been strong supporters and sponsors as well of this seminar today on tackling racism. So warm welcome to you, Professor Michael Hanford and Professor Singh Ching from Cardiff University. Warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's always lovely to be invited to give a talk, but I don't know if I've ever been invited to give such an important talk in my career, to be honest. So thank you, Uzo and colleagues. It's very humbling to be here. Singh and I will be talking today mainly about two PhD studentships that have been funded by the Welsh Government and the DTP, the Doctoral Training Programme, that we'll be supervising. But in order to get there, let me first give you a bit of background on our talk, which is titled Embedding Anti-Racist Culture in Schools in Wales, Understanding Barriers and Attitudes. Now, let me just, I've got a multitask here because I'm on the phone to change the slides. So, excellent. Okay, that works great. So, in terms of the two PhD students, we're looking really at barriers and attitudes. So there's a nice quote from Van Dyke who talks about the system of racist domination consists of two major dimensions: racist cognition, such as prejudices and ideologies, and racist action, such as discrimination, exclusion, and oppression. So I've highlighted some keywords here that relate to our studentship. So racist cognition, which of course will be examined through things like attitudes of various stakeholders in schools, and also racist actions, much more kind of systemic barriers to people entering and succeeding in the workplace. And of course, by people, I mean Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities and people in those communities. So those are going to be the focuses of the PhD students. Now, of course, another key term in this whole topic area is culture. It was lovely to hear Professor Hughes talking about the intercultural aspects of this. Now, when you're thinking about culture, of course, it's normal to think of it as a noun, isn't it? So culture is a thing, but it can be also quite useful to think of culture as a verb. And this draws, of course, on the work of people like Stuart Hall, Brian Street, and others. So rather than saying culture as a monolithic thing, if we think about it in terms of social actions, things that we do, that can be quite I think quite an empowering way of thinking about it, because it allows us to think that, okay, this is not a solid thing, it's something that we actually do, therefore if it's something we can do, it's something we can change. But of course, it's not a very simple thing to change culture, is it? Because it's not just what we're doing now, it's what we've always done. So it's that historical aspect that is very important as well. So, I mean, and we can think about the history from 2 points, can't we? In terms of now to the future, as it were, where do we want to be in 10 years' time? But also now in terms of the past. And our PhD students are probably going to be looking more at kind of where we are now, and that will help us understand where we want to be in the future. Okay, let me just switch. So in terms of why cultural change is particularly difficult, it brings to mind that idea of, well, I wouldn't start from here. But cultural change is so difficult, as Rogers, Meehan and Tani say, because cultural change involves transforming a culture and influencing people's deepest beliefs and most habitual behaviors. So really, we're talking about values at one aspect here, aren't we? And also what people do. So in order to effect cultural change, we really need to have two things: changing people's values that will then affect their beliefs and their actions, but also strong leadership. And I think it's very, very encouraging, isn't it, what we've heard already today about what's happening in Wales in terms of leadership that is beginning to form in various different groups and powerful policymakers and lots of areas, which is very encouraging because, of course, it hasn't always been the case and isn't the case in many other places. We've got this quote here from a survey of the Australian schools context back from 2007, when the findings suggest that the majority of school managers in Australia did not understand the nature or the extent of racism and were ill-equipped to deal with the more covert expressions of racism, the systemic institutional aspects, of course. And, you know, at least there's encouragement, isn't there, that a light is being shone in these areas now in Wales. And when we can understand where we are, then we can understand much more easily about how to get there. When we're thinking about educational context, I think we can think about different levels. So there's the demographic level of, you know, which groups are there. We can apply maybe an intersectional lens and think of it not just in terms of race, but also race and class together, race and gender together, race, class and gender together, looking at different groups from that perspective. There's also, of course, the curriculum level, which Professor Williams was talking so eloquently about earlier. And there's also the interactional, attitudinal level. How do people interact in the playground? How do they interact in the teacher's room? How do they interact in the classroom? As I've mentioned a couple of times, we've got these two questions when we're thinking about these different things. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? And for our PhD students, I think that the focus is very much on where are we now in order to let us decide where we're going to be. Also, one PhD student, I say, will be looking at kind of barriers that teachers face in entering the profession. That's probably going to be more focused on the demographic aspects, and another PhD student will be looking at the interactional aspects, which reflect the attitudinal reality. That's going to be more C. So they won't be focusing so much on the curriculum, I think. In order to understand where we are, sorry, that's better. My phone keeps dropping out. In order to understand where we are in terms of the situation in Wales, of course, there's the Race Equality Action Plan for Wales that came out. I won't go through this quote in detail, but it lists the various problems and barriers that exist in the current Welsh context. You know, things like, although maybe around 9% of students in Wales, pupils, would self-identify as coming from Black ethnic, minority ethnic backgrounds and Asian backgrounds, only about 1.3% of teachers do. And if we're looking at Black teachers, it's like 0.2%. So, and in terms of head teachers, I think it's 0%. So, you know, these are obviously big, important areas that we have a light shone on and we can understand where to move forward, but it really is an enormous task. And when we're thinking about stakeholders, of course, it's not just the teachers, it's the parents, it's been said before what happens at home, it's the policymakers, it's the head teachers, students themselves, so various other stakeholder groups involved. Okay, with that, I'll stop and I'll hand over to my colleague Sinyi.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Uzo, for that generous introduction. I'm very honored to be invited, included in this very important collective commitment and effort to effect changes. I feel the collective energy in the room, and thank you. So just to, without repeating what Mike already said about the two projects we wrote 2 years ago now, with the very valuable input from Race Council, Uzo yourself, and one of your colleagues also sat in the interview panel, and also Ben from the Education Workforce Council. And not least that it is funded by the Welsh Government and the Wales Doctoral Training Partnership. So in itself, these two PhD projects and studentship is a firm commitment of moving forward to change things, all the way to begin to change the demographics of PhD students. That's because we know that in the UK Research Innovation or the Institute, there is a severe underrepresentation of postgraduate research students. So having sorted through an outstanding pool of applicants, we have two exceptionally bright and outstanding students who got the studentships. They started last year, and the first one is Anna Yejiang. She will be focusing on promoting diverse workforce and inclusion in Welsh schools. And as Mike already highlighted, increasing diversity in the workforce is one thing, but that doesn't necessarily change attitudes and beliefs and the culture. So understanding the reasons and the impact of underrepresentation of Black, Asian, and other minority ethnic teachers in Welsh schools is a fundamental aspect of this project. And also with a further goal of looking for identifying the potential solutions that would lead to increasing diversity and promoting inclusion in our schools. So, and there's a very a brief bio of Anna in here, which I won't read out, but she has a UNESCO background, and we are very pleased to have Anna working on this project. And again, this project dovetails very nicely to Professor Hughes' comment earlier about changing intercultural values in teaching in our schools. And let me just go back to the slides. And not least, the second project by Penny Ding, and another of our outstanding PhD students. Currently, two students are completing their research masters and getting equipped to with the best methodological tools they need to go into the field next year. And again, with we're looking forward to working closely with the Race Council and the Education Workforce Council to understand from trainees to teachers, exploring the career journeys of people of colour in the teaching profession in Wales. So currently, with the three research questions highlighted in this slide, whether there is a awarding gap in initial teaching training, why don't they even go into teaching training from Black and minority ethnic groups? And also, do Welsh schools attract and hire people of colour to fill the teaching vacancies? And finally, what are the racialized experiences of these teachers from trainee to being in the profession? And Penny has a first-class degree in psychology and has done a lot of work in the student guild in Exeter University. So we're very pleased to have two students on board. So just to say that, to conclude, these projects are still emerging, and clearly they might change in terms of research design and also to refine the goals as the projects develop. And we have a number of possible outcomes that we anticipate, hopefully, with the findings as emerging from those two PhD projects, they will inform and effect changes in the hiring practices in schools, raise awareness at how institutional racism operates in schools, and seeing how these practices and policy that enable them. And hopefully it will lead to development of programs and practices to change attitudes towards diversity, as well as the anti-racist policies that have been spoken about eloquently this morning, and also practices in school. And in the meantime, hopefully we'll improve the collaboration between different stakeholders and communities as well. And thank you again for Race Council and for all the wonderful input from the Education Welsh Council as well. We're very happy to be here. Thank you very much. Diolch.
Thank you so much, Professors Hanford and Professor Singh Ching. And we have had excellent feedback from communities asking for your email address. I've sent those through, and please post them as well on the external link for all our webinar viewers to contact you about your research work. Okay, I'm just on the verge of introducing one of the most inspirational ministers. Well, I have to say, I had the honor of serving as her specialist advisor, and the work on anti-racism that the minister has done, and the First Minister and the whole of Welsh Government Cabinet, to embed and to push forward for an anti-racist Wales is phenomenal. And I'm sure that the minister herself will tell you that this is just the beginning of a journey of 1,000 miles, but it's starting with one step in the right direction, hand in hand with Black, Asian, and minority ethnic community leaders, civil servants, with our First Minister and Minister for Social Justice leading this work to embed anti-racism and to state an ambitious plan to see racism completely eradicated in Wales by 2030. If you are positive to support this initiative and see people like me, Asian, Black, minority ethnic people, Gypsy traveler, Roma people, live lives free of fear, support this plan and work with the minister. A warm and hearty welcome to our fantastic Minister of Social Justice, Minister Jane Hutt. Welcome, croeso.
Diolch yn fawr, Uzo, Professor Owubi. I'm so pleased to be here today with you. It's really vital in terms of our crucial milestone in the anti-racist calendar is always the United Nations, the United Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It is an important point in terms of commemoration and celebration, and also to take stock of where we are and where we need to go. And I do want to, as always, thank Race Council Cymru for using your skills of partnership and engagement, your evidence, the experience and expertise you have to organise this event, and to all of those who are taking part, working together to create the anti-racist Wales we all want to see. So Welsh Government, again, valuing all your contributions. We're also delighted to have be able to fund this event with that all-important theme of changing our future Welsh history, embedding anti-racism in education and business in Wales. And promoting race equality and social cohesion have always been priorities for the Welsh Government, with the principle of equality, commitment to equality, written into our DNA. But it is our anti-racist Wales action plan that we have now got to strive to take forward and embed, to implement. It's built on the values of anti-racism. It calls for zero tolerance of racism in all its guises. And you know, how did it come about? Well, it was co-constructed. We talk about this and it could be just a sort of jargon, oh, co-construction. It actually, we do believe, was co-constructed, is still ongoing in terms of implementation. It's together with our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, identifying a vision and values for an anti-racist Wales. It reflects our commitment to not just listen to Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, but actually to take action, to make changes in ways that are tangible to their communities. And that was always the challenge as we met together over the last 2 years. We've had enough plans. What about implementation? What about that implementation gap? Is this serious? Is this different? It is grounded in a recognition of the need for fundamental change. Eliminating racism in both education and business are key goals within the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. And we are committed, and you've heard, and we've already had the great benefit of hearing from your earlier speakers. We're committed to take an inclusive and anti-racist approach to teaching and the school experience. And again, to thank Professor Charlotte Williams for her huge contribution to guiding us with this. And we need to obviously move to improve the experiences of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic pupils, learners and teachers in schools. And we expect schools to promote race equality within education settings, to challenge racist and xenophobic incidents, and to prioritise how we will support schools to address racism and race inequality behaviours in a visible and tangible way. So we've also addressed how learners in Wales engage with different historical, racial, cultural and ethnic experiences, and an understanding of this diversity and the need to challenge racist behaviours is a core part of the new curriculum for Wales. And it is so important that our schools will once again lead the way as Wales becomes the first UK nation to make teaching of Black, Asian, minority ethnic histories and experiences mandatory in the school curriculum. Not an option, mandatory here in Wales. We're also committed to improving the diversity of the teaching workforce who deliver this inclusive curriculum. This is vital. So this is about embedding anti-racist professional learning, ensuring that our school practitioners and school support groups are confident in leading positive discussions around anti-racism and cultural diversity, improving understanding of diversity and racism in the wider education sector. And whilst we work on the development of the plan, we continue to work to combat racism and hateful attitudes across Wales. We're funding the Hate Crime in Schools project that aims to equip pupils in over 150 schools with critical thinking skills to enable them to identify misinformation and hateful narratives. And as part of our whole school approach to wellbeing, we've provided funding in the current year of £600,000 to local authorities to embed universal and targeted interventions in schools. But we also know that some groups of learners are more affected by emotional and mental health problems and may experience difficulties or be uncomfortable discussing emotional difficulties due to stigma. And those learners include some of those who are part of one or more vulnerable or historically marginalised groups, including those with protected characteristics, refugee and asylum seeker children and young people, gypsy and traveller children and young people, and children from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. The Welsh Government also fully supports the #ZeroRacism campaign. And I'm delighted that Ysgol Morgan Floyd recently became the first school in Wales to sign up to become the first school in Wales to publicly pledge that they are anti-racist. So I do congratulate all the 900 pupils and staff. It's a momentous achievement. And we hope that will be replicated in schools and workplaces right across Wales. They are in the lead. They will share their experience and their knowledge and their understanding. In business, the Welsh Government Employability Plan already sets out a number of key commitments to support those furthest from the labour market. And this includes delivering an individualised approach to employability support, promoting inclusivity, requiring organisations who deliver our programmes to demonstrate commitment to diversity, inclusivity and equality. We have recognised that we need to take further action to tackle the structural and systemic racism that prevents people from accessing the skills, training and employment prospects that exist in Wales. So we've made a number of commitments in our Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan to tackle this. We'll use our social partnership approach and structures to develop and implement changes in organisational process, policies and procedures that improve fair work outcomes for Black, Asian and minority ethnic employees, and will improve workplace compliance with equality law and tackle workplace discrimination, bullying and harassment from recruitment practices and right through the career ladder. We'll support equality, diversity and inclusion and promote anti-racist workplace practices through implementing the Fair Work agenda, because Welsh Government is committed to creating more diverse, cohesive and productive workplaces and a more effective voice and participation for Black, Asian and minority ethnic workers in challenging discrimination. And we also fully support ethnic minority people undertaking apprenticeships. So we've covered particular areas today in our Race Equality Action Plan for an Anti-Racist Wales. There are particular areas relating to education, employment and business. But of course, the plan covers every aspect of life. What's been so important about this plan is that it is not just being co-constructed with Black, Asian, minority, ethnic people, groups and organisations, with mentors coming into the Welsh Government, working alongside senior officials. They're the ones who are going to implement the plan with our leadership as ministers. I've also worked bilaterally across the Welsh Government as lead minister for social justice, with the support of the First Minister, with every minister, so that in the last few weeks, when we've been analysing the consultation results, meeting with particularly our economy minister, our education minister, in relation to these policy areas that we're discussing today, and looking at revised actions that have come out of the consultation in the plan that we will be shortly, for the final plan, we will be shortly announcing and publishing. And so drawing in that commitment across government leadership to deliver this. And of course, then that has to be cascaded through local government and through to education and our further and higher education institutes, but also through social partnership. We do that with all our colleagues in the private, third and public sector as well. So this is a really important occasion today to drive home that message. This has to be about your leadership as well as my leadership, your commitment to implementation, and to make the real change in Wales, to make Wales an anti-racist nation. As we speak today, to strive to be a nation of sanctuary. I mean, this has to be embedded in the hearts and minds of every Welsh citizen, every Welsh learner, every business as we respond to the Ukrainian refugee humanitarian crisis. We see that outpouring, we see that recognition, that embracing of the nation of sanctuary commitment. And we need to not be complacent. We need to recognise there's a hard work ahead of us. We will make sure that Wales is leading the way. And I think your contributions today from every one of you will help guide us as we move forward. We're at the start of what will be a long process, but we need your help in tackling race inequality in our education sector and business world. And thank you so much again for showing leadership in this area and for Race Council Cymru bringing us together in such a powerful way. Diolch yn fawr I chi gyd. Thank you to you all.
Diolch yn fawr, Minister. We stand with you to say, let's Wales stand hand in hand to eradicate racism by 2030. And we'll continue to shout out about the work that you're doing with the anti-racism plan. Diolch yn fawr, Minister. And thank you for supporting the conference. And now we're going to warmly welcome the General Campaign Manager and Director of Show Racism the Red Card, Mr. Dean Pimble, whose work is absolutely transformational. We have heard of the work that the Show Racism the Red Card have been doing in Wales, and to see Dean pick up this work from Sunil and continue to power ahead to ensure that school children have lessons and sessions that enable them to articulate their challenges in terms of racism and what they're experiencing. It is absolutely important. We warmly welcome you, Dean, as you share with the audience today. Diolch yn fawr. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you very much, Uzo, and thanks for that welcome. And good morning, everyone. First, it's been great to hear the inspirational speakers this morning, and we're proud and honoured to be presenting today and to be part of the work that's already taken place and that's going to continue to take place in Wales, tackle racism and racial inequalities. A little bit of information about Race and Red Card. We're an anti-racism education charity. Our work uses the power of sport and positive role models to combat racism and share our anti-racism message. We achieve this through producing educational resources, developing activities and delivering these activities to encourage people, including young people, to challenge racism, and also challenging racism in the game of football and other sports. We deliver workshops and education to children, young people, families and adults across the UK, with my role focusing on Wales, although I am currently in Leeds, where I've been working with the English FA on referee education around racism and equality, diversity and inclusion. And our work focuses on schools, colleges, universities, workplaces, football clubs, and sporting environments, as well as within a community setting. I mean, that's really important. Project we're going to talk today about is our partnership with the National Education Union, where we deliver initial teacher training to individual and students on the PGCE course. So traditionally, before the pandemic, we know that since the pandemic, things have had to change. But traditionally, we did a full day of in-person training, and we'll be looking at a number of items. This will include an introduction to anti-racism, discussing what is anti-racism, what is racism, giving a good understanding to the students involved. And this includes public sector quality duties and the Equality Act. We looked at recognizing and responding to unconscious bias. We touched on terminology, which is really important within a school setting, classroom resources, and also practical strategies to embed anti-racism within the teacher's classroom. We certainly looked at recognizing and responding to racist incidents and recording and reporting these instances as well. And we know quite well that, you know, a number of racist incidents aren't reported up and down the country in Wales. Since the pandemic came into force and over the last 2 years, we've certainly had to adapt our delivery. And in honesty, some of our delivery has been adapted for the better. So now we're able to deliver live online sessions. This is either a full day or we can have different modules spread across a number of days. We've got fully pre-recorded sessions, or we've got hybrid approach where some sessions will be pre-recorded and sent out, followed by a question and answer and a discussion on questions. A lot of universities have now started taking the option of doing 3 2.5-hour sessions spread throughout the year. And we think this has been invaluable with creating that space for students to reflect and feedback on their own practices and possibly their own biases. It's encouraging to see providers writing the training into their course modules and ensure time and space is actually provided for the individuals to learn and reflect as well. Our main area we like is when it's live and there's discussions between peers. We think that's really important, talking about their lived experiences and how we can unpick and break down those lived experiences and what that actually means within the education setting. We've achieved a lot. So this project has been going with the NEU for over 10 years now. We've worked with over 4,500 students on ITT and education programs, and we've been delivering in the medium of Welsh and English, which is essential within Wales. We work with 7 universities, and some of the feedback in 2021 was that 94% of participants rate the sessions excellent or very good, and they reported increased confidence in tackling racism in the education space. Every year, large majority of participants have reported increases in confidence in talking about racism and certainly recognizing and responding to racist incidents. The content has shifted. We're now looking at a more proactive anti-racism approach rather than the reactive approach. So we're looking at how can we stop racism happening within schools instead of what will we do if there's a racist incident happening. There's a lot more focus on that self-reflection and challenging individuals as well. So challenging yourself. It's really interesting that students' knowledge has seemed to increase since the unfortunate death of George Floyd. although some students still say that racism isn't a problem. Discussions are being activated in deeper level. Our perceptions and responses to the war in Ukraine, be the refugees from Ethiopia, and how anti-Russian sentiment may play out in the schoolyard, and what we need to do about this. And if you have a look on the screens now, we can see a quote that racism is a problem that continues today, if not increased. My recent events and the event of Black Lives Matter, where I'm touching on that, this is where students' understanding of Black Lives Matter hasn't come about since the death of George Floyd, but that's some of their opinions. So we unpick that and actually give the narrative of when it did start. All have emphasized the importance of a charity such as Show Race and Red Card. The training has equipped me with the skills and knowledge that are key to tackling racism within the school in a sensitive and professional manner. Racism should not be suffered in any circumstances. It's a human right to prevent racism, and therefore a charity such as Show Race and Red Card is crucial in making this a reality in schools across Wales. And I don't think it's just Show Race and the Red Card's job. You can see from all the inspirational partners we've got in this call today that we've got a lot of work to be done. There's a lot done, but there's a lot more to do. And with the skills and expertise of the people on this call today, we're certainly going to reach that. So the benefits of what we're achieving so far. Just work on my clicker. So we look at building participants' confidence in being proactively racist. And that's a lot through self-reflection, practical tips as in creating inclusive displays in schools. Equip participants with the tools to act decisively and effectively if racism does occur. So giving them guides to recognize and responding, having challenging conversations, but certainly looking at how they deal with the perpetrator, the target, but also looking at those bystanders to make sure that they understand that this isn't acceptable. Give participants the opportunity to share their own experiences, reflect and learn from each other, and signals that the funder and university take anti-racist stance as well. Make sure that people from racialized communities feel more confident and report it being taken seriously, and they may experience racism and increased feelings of safety and inclusion, important when bearing in mind the ethnic makeup of the teaching profession, which as we know is primarily white. Challenges we have, it hasn't been all plain sailing. Certainly there's challenges that come with delivering this, and we're reliant on course leaders and other gatekeepers making it a priority and offering the space and time. Students, their own backgrounds, experiences, and their perceptions of racism, the lack of student knowledge and experience, and Welsh language, certainly making sure we've got the right people equipped to deal and tackle it using the medium of Welsh, and that's really important. Some of the feedback from the course leaders, the students were actively engaged and shared their own individual experiences. The presentation was fantastic, with lots of interest, information, and helpful advice. And another feedback was just a quick word to thank you and our colleagues for 3 excellent sessions this week. All the hard work involved is much appreciated. The discussions continued after the session, and in fact, a new Teams group was created by the trainee teachers, and conversations continued to happen for 3 hours. And we think these conversations and best practice, continuing to reflect on their own practice and experience, is really important to continue to improve and provide the best experience for pupils, ensure they become ethnically informed citizens. And then some of the participants, go on, Uzo.
Time is up, sorry.
No problem, Uzo.
Do you want to round up with the final statement?
Yeah, and I think from our participant feedback, we really look at talking about racism, lived experience, racial trauma in individuals is difficult, and looking at yourself can be really uncomfortable. We're happy to be uncomfortable in certain settings. For example, a gym, we know we're going to be uncomfortable, and physically we will be, but we're not as uncomfortable when we look at our cognitive development. So it's really important that we explain to the students that at points they are going to be uncomfortable. With that uncomfortableness, there is going to be gain, and they're going to gain improved cognitive development and understanding of racism, and certainly how to tackle that within the school setting.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Dean Pembo. Please be aware that you can see the full speech by Dean again on the 21st of March, which is the United Nations Day for Eliminating Race Discrimination. Every single video, every single speaker will be featured and live streamed right across all Race Council portals, Black History portals, Zero Racism portals, so you can watch again. And also we'll be streaming the talk of Professor Emmanuel Ogbonna. But right now, to introduce two powerful women of Wales who are making huge moves in the education sector and are leading change is we firstly go to Chantal Horton, who is the chair of Black History Management Committee, Black History Wales Management Committee, vice chair of BAMEd Education, and we go to Dr. Susan Davis, who is the chair of BAMEd, and they're together forming DARPOL. These women are absolutely rocking hot on education, anti-racism, and embedding change. I'm too excited. Let's warmly welcome them. Shanti and Susie, over to you.
Good morning, Uzo, and good morning, everyone. Sue and I are so excited to be with you here this morning. As Uzo said, you know, behind all of us strong women here, there's a story, and there's many stories. We can't show you much, but we can show you a glimpse today. Sue and I work together in the hard work, in the heart work. We wear hats in Cardiff Metropolitan University, in BAMEd Wales Network, and also in DARPOL. So we're going to share some stories about the heart work. And as Professor Charlotte Williams said earlier, that none of us can do this alone, that together we're stronger. And we're going to talk to you about some of the work that we've done about building strategic collectives for Pan-Wales solutions. We're talking about actions here in our short few moments with you in what we can do in innovation to ensure change. Rennie Edo-Lodge recently said that she stopped talking to people about race because treacle covers their eyes and sort of goes into their ears. And we need to have these conversations, and we need to think about how we, in our everyday actions, don't need to be household names, but we can make small, consistent steps to be part of this movement. So in our short few moments with you, we invite you to think about what are you doing in your role every single day to ensure that we move towards our anti-racist Wales. Over to Dr. Susan Davis, and we'll share some glimpses of our stories as we go through.
Thank you so much, Chantal, and also thank you to Dean as well. And we take on board, Dean, what you said about the fact that this is not easy work, and there is always going to be a level of discomfort, and that's something that that is an absolute given. But as you said, that the more we feel discomfort, that the more change we can make. I just wanted to read to you a little extract from somebody that means a lot to me, Sidney Poitier, who died very recently. He was always a constant in my childhood, and he reminds me very much of my own father, who was a black teacher in Wales. So the parallels there are very strong for me. So I read his book very recently, and I just wanted to read you an extract from what Sidney says. So basically, setting the context, so I'm reading from The Measure of a Man by Sidney Poitier, 1927 to 2022. So this is what he says. The idyll of my life on Cat Island. Our family didn't drink from glassware, we drank from enamel cups. I couldn't remember ever having seen a looking glass in our house or any other kind of glass. No glass windows, no glass doors, no stores with glass fronts. Reflections, of course, from pond water, baking pans. That's all I had. Never was I able to recall having seen myself in a mirror. So I never got a fix on my colour, no reason to, with no frame of reference to evidence its necessity, the issue never arose. But outside the island of my early years, a world was waiting. That world would focus on my colour, to the exclusion of all else. Never caring to go beyond that superficial characteristic to see what else I might have to offer. So I find that very poignant indeed, for a number of reasons, personal and professional. Okay, I'm trying to go on to the next slide. There we go. So we're going to tell you a little bit about our work. So really, that's one of the reasons why I do this work, to be honest with you. So we're going to tell you a little bit now. As Uzo said, Chantal and I work in a voluntary capacity on the BayMed network. We started this network 2 years ago. And the BayMed network is part of a wider UK network, and we were asked by Penny Rabbiger, who's one of the executives on the national network, to start this up in Wales. We've currently got about 80 members, and that includes people of colour, teachers of colour, TAs, and people working in other educational professions, and our white allies. So there are quite a few of us now, and we are doing some quite stellar work. So Chantal and I are going to share with you now what we're actually doing. So what we've achieved so far, we have achieved a teach meet. We worked very closely with BayMed, our colleagues and friends in BayMed Bristol, and we had a successful teach meet, which I believe is still online if you wanted to access it, where we showcased some fantastic work going on across Wales in our schools, and also what's going on in Bristol schools. We supported a range of colleagues through our Time to Talk sessions, which did happen every Tuesday. They were very successful in that if any of our colleagues, teachers of colour, TAs of colour, had any issues or wanted to just have a chat with somebody, then that's what our Tuesday sessions were all about. So they were very successful. We also have a range of resources that you can have a look at on our website. So do check that out. We've got a Padlet with lots of wonderful stuff on there, which we think might be of interest and helpful to you. We've also very much been seen as a one-stop shop now by organisations. As our colleague Ben Lester talked about in his presentation, we recently endorsed their anti-racist guide, and we've also done some work with Ben on a variety of different projects. So I think people are coming to us now for kind of in an advisory role, which is great. What else have we been doing? We've also been working with Welsh Government, and Chantal will tell you a little bit more about that later on. We've organised a national conference, which we, in collaboration with our colleagues at EWC, and many of the speakers who are on here today, our wonderful Uzo spoke at that conference, and I was very lucky to speak to Sathnam Sankera, the author, who we had a bit of a conversation, which was wonderful, because I am a big fan. And what else?
I'm so sorry.
Yes,
I want to just add a little bit about that event in November, because I think it was a really pivotal moment. There were over 800 schools who engaged with the materials live, and beyond that more. And we've had lots of conversations with schools about, implementing the recommendations that were put out there by Professor Charlotte Williams, Welsh Government, and our ministerial working group, and Dr. Susan Davis and I were part of that. And having lots of conversations on a daily basis with leaders in education has really, really sprouted and spiraled from that event. So I think that there's a lot of work to do, but there are a lot of conversations happening now that haven't, and that was a pivotal moment. So lots of people within this event took part. So it is online, available online. So do go and have a look at sort of golden snapshots of that day, especially the conversation with Sue and Sathnam, which was inspiring and really informative.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Shan. And then Chantal's going to talk to you in a couple of slides about the DARPL work, which Professor Charlotte mentioned earlier on, because we're doing lots of things with DARPL through BayMed. And also next week, actually, Chantal and I are off to London for a conference at the BET Education Show, and we'll be talking. We've got a BayMed takeover, so we're going to be flying the Welsh flag and talking about Wales at that conference. I mean,
what's remarkable about our small country is that so much is going on, so much needs to be done, because there are terrible things happening that we need to make sure that they stop. And we all have professional and personal stories about those experiences here in this room, I'm sure. But I think it's really important that we recognise that as a small country, we are starting to make ripples. I was lucky enough to go to the NEC to talk on behalf of Professor Charlotte Williams and the working group a while ago. And there was a really emotional response from some head teachers and leaders within that room who were in awe of some of the things that are happening here in policy and reform and curriculum reform. So we need to really push on with this in education. I know that we're focusing on business as well, but in education, there's lots of people are looking at the spotlight on Wales right now and our small country. Big things in our small country.
Whoops, that's me. Sorry, I've gone. Okay, thank you so much, Shan. I'm using my clicker. Yeah, okay, so on this slide, this just sort of sets out some of the things that we're going to be doing as our next steps. So we're going to continue, hopefully, to grow our membership. And if there's anybody out there that would like to join us, you're more than welcome. Please have a look at our Twitter account and please have a look at our website and please do join us. As Chantal said, we're starting to input into Welsh policy, Welsh Government policy. We're sort of doing some lobbying as well. And we're hoping very much to start mentoring young teachers of colour. And that's something that we're very, very passionate about because we really believe that is the way forward, giving them positive role models, and representation is everything, isn't it? Let's be honest. So we're very, very keen to grow our numbers of young Black and brown teachers in Wales. And we believe that mentoring is the way for us to do that and the way forward. We're also signposting people to our anti-racist practice materials, and we believe that's making an inroad as well. And as I said, we meet monthly, and we're always really busy, and we've got lots and lots to do. And please, if you fancy joining us, we'd love to have you along. I think the next slide now is Chantal is going to tell us a little bit about DARPL. So I think there's a little bit of a time delay on this slide. There we go. So DARPL, over to you, Chantal.
DARPL was a seed of an idea, and I suppose it's spreading more seeds. It's changing conversations and thoughts within educational settings across Wales. And Welsh Government has supported an idea for us to continue our commitment into strategic collectives. We found within the conversations within Professor Charlotte Williams' work and the Ministerial Working Group conversations that people with professional and lived experience really wanted to be part of this change and an active part in innovation. And DARPL brings together a range of small and widely independent partners as well as bigger organisations. So we were really excited to launch the draft website page for DARPL this week, but that's a work in progress and there's lots more to come. We're calling it a virtual campus, and it will be a hub for practice, research, professional learning. In Professor Charlotte Williams' work, she talked about professional learning being key to this step change, and as well as embracing the diverse histories that we have here in Wales, making sure that we have Black, Asian and minority ethnic presence, contributions, and knowledge within our curriculum. We also need to think about shifting our everyday practice from a non-racist stance to an anti-racist stance in learning and pedagogy. And so one of the things that DARPL is doing is to embrace this idea of professional learning for whole nation approaches within schools. What's a whole school approach? Teachers, governors, head teachers, people who are working with those beyond in consortia and regional approaches, caretakers, office staff, lunchtime supervisors. Everyone needs to have some sort of professional sustained learning in relation to shifting from non-racist to anti-racist approaches. And so we've been giving lots of opportunities for free, live professional learning. If you haven't heard about DARPL, don't worry, the green shoots are just shooting, but there are some live sessions now, amazing people we're working with. We're working with Arts Council Wales, Literature Wales, Education Workforce Council, and we're working with small partners such as Abu Bakr, a Welsh historian, Rachel Clark, who's going to talk with us afterwards, and so on. I mean, really behind us all, as we talked about earlier, behind us all here are personal and lived experiences. And one of the things that really struck me in the work is that this sense of conniving that I felt as a child in the curriculum, the Mrs. Betty Campbell, my teacher, my neighbour, who would take me by the hand to school, actually get that, you know, instilled in us. In contrast then to the experience that Dr. Susan Davis had in her education. So what we want to do is to really think about this in a professional learning context. So we are looking at curriculum also and curriculum design. We've got a research element, so we will be researching, and we've got a funded EdD place, which will be looking at implementation of the recommendations in schools, and Lillian Martin is doing that. We also have lots of events, and one of the events is a senior leader event that's coming up in May. In addition to some of the things that we talked about, we also are both senior lecturers in Cardiff Metropolitan University, and we were funded to do some research by Welsh Government following on from Ben's EWC report, a phase 2 report, which highlighted the need to explore recruitment and retention issues for teachers coming from diverse backgrounds in Wales and the lack of them. What really has changed since Mrs. Betty Campbell was my head teacher in the 70s? 36,000 teachers-ish in 2019 were recorded, but actually about 1,066 of those were coming from diverse backgrounds. What has changed? That the research findings informed Welsh Government's ITE action plan, and there's a lot going on in HEIs at the moment to really reform and think about changing that landscape. We were part of a really diverse research team, and I'm going to hand over to Sue to talk a little bit more about the research.
Okay, thank you, Shan. Yes, so as Chantal said, we carried out some research for Welsh Government looking at recruitment into initial teacher education and also career progression for Black and brown teachers in Wales. As you can see, we were a very multicultural, multi-ethnic team. Our research assistant, Sammy Chapman, who was white, is actually really interesting in that he hadn't done any work in this area before, but he ended up calling out his nan at Christmas dinner for being racist, which we thought was really interesting. So basically, as Chantal said, what we found out during this research, and I'm just going to move the slide, was that there is a need for more role models in the Welsh education system to increase representation of minority ethnic teachers. So that's not really anything that we didn't know. But it was interesting. There were some other really vital themes that came out of the research. One of them was around mental health and racism, and that our teachers of colour in Wales are suffering with their mental health for a variety of reasons. And they all said that racism had impacted on them and on their mental health. And I think it's really important to set out here that these people are not victims of racism. They had racism perpetuated against them, and sometimes in ways where they didn't even, until they spoke to us during the research trial, and they actually said, oh gosh, I think that was racist. So quite often they almost blanked these things out because they seemed to be the norm of what is going on. So obviously it affected their confidence, it affected their self-esteem, and it also affected their sense of worth. It affected their promotion prospects, because if you're coming from a kind of almost on the back foot, your confidence has been knocked. You then feel that you're not deemed worthy to go up to a higher grade, and that's something we really do need to address. So I think it's really important that we look at this as a kind of a whole school, a whole Wales issue, and we kind of address the elephant in the room, in that the school workforce in Wales is predominantly white, and thus we need our white allies to step up to the plate and look at it as their responsibility. Are we nearly at time now, Uzo?
What was really interesting and powerful in talking to the 68 participants is that their voices and their recommendations were upheld by Welsh Government into the action plan for recruitment for ITE for teachers coming from diverse backgrounds, which was published in October 2021. So their voices turned into some really positive action for change.
And I think we need to end. We'd just like to read this slide, and this is from Universities UK, and they say it is critical that educational leaders understand lived experiences and create culturally inclusive opportunities and expectations which celebrate diversity and champion fair representation. So diolch yn fawr, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolutely fantastic. Dr. Susie Davis and Chantal Horton. We look forward to hearing more from DAPL in the future. I'm powering ahead now. Thank you to everyone who's sending a question. We've got a series of questions all lining up. But before we get to our questions, our absolutely amazing Rachel Clark, who is an embodiment of her grandmother, Mrs. Betty Campbell, MBE, our beloved Black History patron late, resting in peace and power. And she stands here as a deputy head teacher to carry on the work. The legacy of her grandmother lives on in her work as a teacher and an educator. So here we warmly welcome you as our positive action champion, but also as a fantastic consultant who is doing incredible work to embed anti-racism. Tell us, how can we embed anti-racism in education and business? Welcome to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel. My details are on the screen there. And just listening to what Chantal, Sue, Dean, and others have said so far this morning, you're not going to hear anything different from me, because actually it's our job, it's our duty to make sure that anti-racism is at the heart of what we do. And although I am Betty Campbell's granddaughter, and I'll talk about that in a short while, actually my journey into the educating educators around anti-racism began when I was on maternity leave, and the whole world and the whole country, for the first time in a really long time, stopped and reflected on where we're at in terms of race relations. That's down to COVID and us being in lockdowns. Obviously, George Floyd's murder was filmed, and then everybody was talking about that. And families were opening up and speaking about lived experiences. And I know that for myself, my dad, who used to work in IBM in the 1970s, and he opened up a really personal story over what his experience was like at a senior level in IBM in the 70s and 80s in London. And that actually he could not be too talented, because it would make his manager feel as if he was too good for his job. And so there was a constant tightrope being walked for him. And I know that echoes the experiences of many minority ethnic people and communities in Wales and beyond that within the wider UK. And so myself and a couple of others thought, right, what are we going to do? I'm a deputy head teacher. My friend who supported with the development of the tools as an assistant head teacher. And so we thought, right, we need a sustained programme, because what hasn't happened in education, irrespective of all the reviews into racial disparities that have happened from the 70s, so if we think about the Rampton report and others since, the same outcomes were being achieved. And so we thought, let's devise a long-term plan for schools and organisations that really does adopt deep level learning around anti-racism and why we all think and feel in the ways we do, but the necessity for us as educators to have that knowledge in order to promote change. And that's been carried out in lots of different schools and also in lots of different organisations, and people have found it really, really useful. It then got me thinking about my grandmother, Betty Campbell, who Uzo's spoken about briefly, who Chantal's spoken about briefly also. And she was somebody who, looking back, I've taken for granted. And I wish if she'd be alive today, we'd have lots more heated discussions, I'm sure, but I'd be able to pick her brains. Things that have really stuck in my mind about some of the conversations we had were over her saying, Rach, I'm still the only black face in head teacher meetings. And even in 2020, she would still have been the only black face, because although there are 7 non-white head teachers in schools across Wales, none of those are from black or black British backgrounds. And we've got to unpick the reasons why. So whilst it's good that some people have managed to break through, actually, why are those numbers so disproportionate? And what are we doing in schools in order to make that change happen? Because I think Sue just spoke about workplace culture and this idea of feeling included. And that has to come through every single school workforce we have. If we've got a hope of giving others the hope and the opportunity of daring to dream and daring to push through. And so my grandmother was somebody who some of you might have known. I know Chantal and Uzo and Sue and some others either were brought up partially by her and lived in the local community or knew her or had meetings with her. But she was a really formidable force. And what people don't often see and talk about, or didn't often see and don't currently talk about, is the other side of that. And the other side of her was somebody who had to continue to push through irrespective of the barriers, and how much that really did wear on her. But because there was such a strong community network of support there and a strong sense of family, those supports were provided in order for her to push through. But had she been from a community background in a local community that wasn't as supportive, she still would have been the same person, but probably wouldn't have made it through to being a head teacher. And she did lots around racism and anti-racism. I know she kept coming to London for meetings to be part of the Commission for Racial Equality. I know she was a partner in the Black History Wales champion work. I know that she was on local community boards. All of that had happened. But it did take a lot out of her, and her committed sense of community, belonging and value is something that I completely took for granted. And on reflection, it's made me who I am today. She was somebody who was unrelenting about everybody being of equal value. And I know some people on this call will be thinking, well, anti-racism might not have anything to do with me because I'm in a school that's either a white majority school or business, or I'm in a space that is a white only space. What I'd like to ask you to consider is this question of value. And what we can't do is keep upholding non-verbally that if you are from a minority ethnic background, you are of lesser value because you're represented less. So in our schools, in our classrooms, we have lots of non-verbal signaling, whether we talk about class displays, who we have to come in for assemblies, the resources that we use within our schools, all of that. So if we only show one version of what a doctor is, what that signaling non-verbally is, this is the only version of a doctor or a dentist or a vet or an astronaut or whoever it might be. I think it's wonderful that Wales has Black history on the curriculum. I guess it's now thinking about how that's going to be woven through consistently and what resources are going to be used. And then the anti-racist education and the professional learning that has to run alongside that to support educators to understand the value and the importance of doing so. Because what my grandmother did for children and young people in her community and in her school was really instill this sense of self, a positive sense of self and that positive sense of belonging and value. And that means that going out into spaces, you are more confident to hold your own. You are more confident, even though you may well be the only one. And it's something, again, that I took for granted completely, but I do now with my own children quite consciously. That I do with the children who are around me, that when I'm leading meetings, I'm always drawing upon those voices that will very easily sit back because they don't have the confidence to come forward. And so as educators, as business leaders, but particularly as educators, we have a duty of care to all children and all young people. And if we have a proportion of society who leave our settings not feeling that their history, their sense of self is valued, all we're doing is contributing to the problem. And it doesn't matter if we've got Black history woven through our curriculum, if those people behind it don't understand the need and the importance for it, the impact is not going to be as strong. And I'm not going to talk for a long period of time about Child Q. And I know that all happened yesterday, but what I will say really briefly is that I think Child Q is quite symbolic of where systemic racism and the intersectionality of it comes into play. and where we have different institutions and groups in society who don't realise that what they're doing is actually harmful, and it makes schools unsafe for people from minority ethnic communities. And we've got to make sure that we give every child and young person that strong, positive sense of self. So how do we do that? Well, embedding takes a journey, and we have to have a really clear starting point for that. Chantal spoke about DARPL as the project lead, and it's wonderful because there are lots of different partners who have worked together to put the materials together. And I think that's a really good starting point for Wales. And I really wish that England adopted the approach Wales has taken. I'm knocking on doors, don't worry. But DARPL is a really good starting point. What I would say is that the embedding work, it does take a sustained approach. It's not a tick box. That's not why DARPL was formed. It's not why anti-racism needs to be on all agendas that take place in schools. It has to be long-term work because we have to be courageous. We have to fight for our young people. We have to want them to be the best version of themselves. And having a long-term approach that really does embed that change is the way forward. And so what I would ask you to really reflect on is what work have you started? What work will you continue? And where do you go next? Do you think that having a one-off anti-racism session as an inset is enough? Is that going to help your teachers, the practitioners that you have, the students coming in? Is that going to help them really understand the embedded racism that exists in society and what we need to do to address that and to change it? Because, as it's already been said, we've got to move from being non-racist to anti-racist. And again, Wales is ahead of the game on that. So definitely it's about the materials you're using and what you're doing to actively change and embed the strategies that you have, as opposed to using one strategy once and thinking next, move along. The next thing is about culture. And I know Dr. Sue spoke about that very briefly, but workplace culture is so important. Who is nurtured? Who is extra time given to? Because the acknowledgement of the fact that starting points differ, that life experiences differ, that outcomes in school differ, and often because racism has been at play sometimes. So who is really championed and given additional time to support them on their journey through the profession? Who speaks out in meetings and who sits back? Who's at the decision-making table? And if people of colour are not at that decision-making table, that's absolutely fine. Who have you then spoken with about their lived experience or about their story, or to find out their opinion on decisions? Because my worry is in our schools across Wales, across England, across the United Kingdom, that we have a very fixed way of viewing things. And because our workforce is made up predominantly of people who identify as being white, actually what it means is that that lens isn't necessarily looked through. And we've all got to get used to looking through our school spaces with an anti-racist lens. Finally, I know I've run out of time, probably, Uzo. What I'd like you to do is just have a read of this quote on the screen. It says, education systems and educational institutions have an important role and responsibility in addressing and eliminating racism, which is why we're all here today. So please value everybody, please be more conscious, and please look through your space with an anti-racist lens. Thank you.
Well, Rachel, we could listen to you for the entire day. Really powerful. Every inch a granddaughter of Betty Campbell. We are just so honored and blessed to have you with us in the education sector, challenging business, challenging educators to be anti-racist. And now we're going to hear from our Minister for Education, Jeremy Miles. Minister is going to address us on anti-racism. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch am fy ngwahoddi heddi I gymryd rhan yn y digwyddiad hwn I nodi diwrnod rhyngwladol y Cenhedloedd Unedig ar gyfer dileu gwahaniaethu ar sail hil. Fel Gweinidog y Gymraeg ac addysg, rwy wedi ymrwymo I sicrhau bod addysg, cyfleoedd a chanlyniadau ein plant a'n pobl ifanc yng Nghymru yn deg ac yn gyfiawn. Mae addysg yn hanfodol I alluogi unigolion I gyflawni I potensial llawn ac nid dim ond goroesi, ond ffynnu drwy gydol I bywydau. However, racism is still a reality for many of our children and young people. Many will experience overt and direct racism through racial bullying and harassment within education settings, often from their peers. All will experience more subtle forms of racism through the everyday reality of our society, the systems, the structures and processes that produce radically differential outcomes for children and young people from ethnic minority groups. The experiences and inequality in outcome for children and young people from ethnic minority communities also has an impact on their aspiration to continue into further and higher education. I'm committed to creating a culture of anti-racism which is embedded across our education system. As set out in our forthcoming Race Equality Action Plan and Anti-Racist Wales, we are committed to a number of goals and actions which are ambitious, long-term and will create real change and impact. These range from requiring that all education institutions in Wales tackle institutional racism as a whole institution approach, to improving the levels of recruitment, retention and progression into leadership of teachers from ethnic minority communities. From expecting every education institution to effectively record and act on incidents of racist abuse, discrimination and bullying, to ensuring that our teaching reflects the histories and experiences of all of our diverse communities in Wales. We've already started this work, but this is just the beginning, and much more still needs to be done to build confidence and resilience within our education system to truly tackle racism. Disgwyliaf ddim goddefgarwch o hiliaeth ym mhob un o'n lleoliadau addysg ac ymrwymiad gweithredol I gynyddu amrywiaeth sefydliadau ar bob lefel. Mae pob un ohonom yn atebol I wireddu ein hymrwymiad I Gymru wrthhiliol erbyn 2030. Diolch yn fawr.
Our Minister Jeremy Miles, and very big thank you to you and all the team for the work that you're doing to improve inclusion and diversity in education.
My name is Emmanuel Obona, and I am going to share my views with you today on how businesses can develop and embed a culture of anti-racism. I don't have very long today, so please forgive me for abandoning the usual preamble and caveats that are associated with these talks. However, I think it is important to clarify what I mean by anti-racism. You see, the mistake we tend to make in society is to view racism as a two-sided construct, wherein we see somebody as either racist or non-racist. This is a major problem. It's a major problem, and it's a problem that partly explains why we've been unable to eradicate racism in society. Because if we view racism in this way, most people are actually non-racist. So we will be asking the question, how is it that we continue to have racism in society when practically everybody is non-racist? Well, that is because we are viewing it wrongly. That's because most people who are non-racist would commonly absolve themselves of this ill of racism, but they don't do anything to prevent racism from occurring in society. This is what commonly happens when we speak of unconscious bias. Unconscious bias occurs because individuals in society, even non-racists, have stereotypes, negative stereotypes of ethnic minorities, which they store in their subconscious. And these stereotypes, unfortunately, become the predictive and prescriptive framework that fills those aspects of our knowledge that we are either unable or unwilling to learn more about, so they become like a functional heuristics for us. And this enables us to be able to navigate life. So when we are making decisions, especially when individuals are in a tight spot, they resort to those stereotypes and they help them to make decisions. And they don't think about it. And because they don't think about it, they see themselves as non-racist. The outcome becomes a continuation of the racialization in society, and the racial orders remain. That's why we look at employment and we see that Black and minority ethnic people, for example, are twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. And we look at every area of life, we find a similar pattern existing. Essentially, non-racism is positive in intention, but it is a passive state. And it is being anti-racist that enables an individual not only to know that racism is wrong, like the non-racist, but also to be willing to do something about it. It is that action orientation that distinguishes anti-racism from non-racism in that sense, or from a non-racist, an anti-racist and a non-racist. And this is why the Race Equality Action Plan for Wales is built on the principles and the values of anti-racism, not non-racism. And this is the position I will encourage all businesses and all people listening to this talk today to adopt. And the key question then is, how do we embed this culture of anti-racism in organization? We need culture change. We need culture change because we have gone for so many years doing things in a particular way. And the only way we can achieve the type of change we require is by having culture change. I could spend all day with you on culture change, but we haven't got the time. So I'm just going to say that we need to develop a culture that has a zero tolerance attitude towards racism. And to do this, every organization will need to undertake an equality audit of some sort, an audit of all their systems, their processes, their procedures, to identify some of those practices that may seemingly be benign, but that if you actually analyze deeply, you will see that they are inadvertently, because often people don't set out to do this thing deliberately, but inadvertently discriminating against people from minority ethnic groups. You audit those systems, you uncover them, and you look to change them. Managers must, of course, think of an equality impact assessment every time they undertake a major change. The law requires this in most instances. Unfortunately, this isn't something that many organizations and managers do. We then need to look at the role of leadership. Leaders are key to developing an anti-racist organization or anti-racist culture. Leaders, after all, are the people that set policies, set the tone, set the behavioral standards for everybody else to adopt. People want to do the things that they believe their leaders value, because after all, the leaders are the ones who are going to determine their pay, determine their promotion, and determine many aspects of their formal existence within organizations. So if we can get leaders to develop an anti-racist orientation, we've succeeded in helping other members of an organization to do the same. What I recommend to organizations is that the senior executives in particular, but all leaders, including managers and supervisors, should have leading an anti-racist organization as part of their key performance indicator. And that means that they are rewarded according to that objective. If it is that important to you, then you must be able to measure it, and you must be able to reward the behavior. And that also means that individuals must have something to lose by not being anti-racist. So it's very important in that sense. The organization must show commitment to anti-racism by including that as part of the key performance indicator and by implication part of the reward package. I recognize that we don't have so long, so I'm just going to focus the rest of my talk on what is potentially the most important source of racism in the labor market, and this is racism in employment. Organizations must recognize that they have a moral and economic imperative to have a workforce that represents the communities they serve. Unfortunately, this is not the case in many instances. There is often the desire of managers to recruit people that replicate essentially the existing types of people that are employed in the organization. This is commonly known as the employment of like-minded people. You know, like-mindedness means it's easier to predict their behaviors, it's easier to control them, it's easier to manage them. So it has all those advantages, but it also has numerous disadvantages. Many organizations are finding that the same type people make the same type decisions. They make the same type mistakes, and it doesn't allow for creativity. It doesn't allow for innovation. You need difference to innovate. You know, if everything is the same, then there is no difference. So that difference is important to organizations. Now, this is why we are encouraging or discouraging, should I say, organizations from employing people purely on the basis of personality fit. Personality fit is not the same as ability to perform in a given job. And we have to focus on ability to perform rather than employing on personality fit. And many organizations are beginning to do more of these. I'll give you an example with Netflix. At Netflix, the chief talent officer recently and explicitly told their recruiters to stop hiring people on the basis that they are the type of individuals they would like to go out for a beer with or for coffee with. And they introduced this scrutiny, additional scrutiny of recruiters, to say you have to justify your selection decisions. Don't justify it on the basis of simple rationale. Oh, I think this person would fit in this organization. Because if you do that, you will employ organization where everybody looks alike. You will replicate the existing patterns that we are trying to dislodge. You will replicate the racialized order in society that exists, and which is what anti-racism is saying we should do something about. There are other things you can do. For example, why don't you consider having a name-blind recruitment system? We know that in applications where people have created names, but that are with identical profiles, but different names, one from an ethnic minority background, obviously sounding name, and then another from a white, obviously sounding name. We know that in the past, researchers have established that the people from minority ethnic backgrounds did not get a similar level of color as their white counterparts with exactly the same qualification. So why don't you consider having name-blind recruitment systems? Why don't you consider setting aspirational targets for ethnic minority representation? There's nothing wrong with looking at the profile where you operate and saying, we will at the very least replicate the profile, the ethnic profile in that area, and set that as a recruitment target. And why don't you use positive action, especially tie break? If you have a situation where you have people or particular groups of people that are underrepresented, whether they are ethnic minority people, disabled people, women, etc., you are allowed under the law to use tie break. In other words, two candidates of equal merit, and one is from an underrepresented community. You are allowed to select that one from an underrepresented community by law. Why don't you try to use that to change the profile, the ethnic profile of your organizations? No. Why don't you insist, especially with your human resource management, that they provide justification? You scrutinize their decisions. Don't just take these subjective rationales that are provided. Such and such a person has a negative attitude. What does that even mean? You know, look for examples, ask why, and make it mandatory for human resource decisions to be explained with appropriate rationales and not just vague rationales. Because the vague rationales provide a hiding place for the modern racist. So we should ask for detailed explanation all the time. If your goal is to develop people from within, you should consider appointing a developmental coach, you know, and make developing people successfully a key indicator of their performance. You could ask managers. You could include it in the development of, in the reward of managers. You know, how many people have you developed in the last 12 months from Black and minority ethnic communities? And you can do that, and people begin to see that it is important, and they then begin to include that as aspects of their behaviors. The final point that I want to make is in relation to data. The idea that people can do this without having information, and information that is accurate, I think is misguided. Unfortunately, many organizations don't even know how many people from minority ethnic people they employ, never mind their levels in the organizational hierarchy, and then their pay grades, etc. All these things are important because without data, you are essentially running a colorblind organization. You know, you are saying to yourself, color doesn't matter here, because these are the type of managers that say this. They say, oh, race is not important here because we are an equal opportunities employer. We have diversity policies, and therefore it's nothing to do with us in this organization. And if you do this, you will be like the ancient Japanese proverb. It will be exactly like that. Now, the ancient Japanese proverb of the three monkeys who variously denied the existence of evil. Except in this case, you will be denying the existence of racism. So the three monkeys will be denying, saying, I see no racism, I hear no racism, and I speak no racism. And that will be wrong at all counts. Thank you very much for listening to my talk.